Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining another of our conversations with employers of cyber people. I hope you're getting on well with the training, and if you have got any issues with that, please do get in touch. Life's a bit hectic at the moment, so if you're not getting immediate responses, please do nudge me or Anya as the need arises. But without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Steve Mills and Jim Booth from SecureCloudPlus, and they're going to tell us a little bit more about the business. They're both ex-military, so a little bit about their own journey from military to civilian life, and some thoughts about where the opportunities lie and how to get from point A to point B. And I've told them that already that, as ever, there are always a lot of questions about qualifications, so any advice on that will be welcome. But please do pop your questions in the chat, and we will get to them either during the course of the webinar or, excuse me, or more likely at the end. So, Steve, Jim, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Right, so good afternoon, everybody. As Andrew's already mentioned, Steve Mills from SecureCloudPlus. So I'm the strategic defence lead for the company. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history around SecureCloudPlus as an organisation and where we've come from and what it is that we do in the market. I'll then touch on my transition personally from the Air Force into the corporate sector and into the commercial world, a couple of the roles that I've done in SecureCloudPlus and how that's shaped my kind of journey from A to B, as Andrew put it. And then I'll hand over to Jim to kind of give you the other side of the coin, because we both come from, although both military backgrounds, I think fair to say, Jim, we've both had fairly different paths, and then have obviously overlapped at SecureCloudPlus, but we also end up working in quite different spaces within the organisation. So hopefully you'll get to see both sides of probably a bit more of a corporate, commercially facing role for myself, and definitely more of a technical and architecture level in Jim's experience. So I'll hog the mic for a little while, but I will make sure we share it back to Jim as well. So SecureCloudPlus, I think the first thing that our CEO, Peter Williamson, who you'll see in a minute, would say is that given his time again, he'd probably change the name, because although named 7 or 8 years ago with a bit of a future view, it does somewhat pigeonhole us a little bit now into people thinking that we're an Amazon Web Services or a Google-esque provider where we own a data center and we're going to sell you some rack space in it. But that's absolutely not what we do. So it's innovative services securely managed is the strapline. So we're a managed service provider, and it is really about delivering a digital outcome for the customer, with our USP being that everything we do is in a classified space. So majority of our project work and our services that we're delivering is at secret or above, but you will find some instances where, I guess in pre-reading you may have seen on our website, there's some case studies where we do work at official sensitive, and we are finding more and more work in that space now actually, but it's often as a door opener to go up to the higher classification. So leveraging that military experience about ways of working in a classified space, leveraging people like Jim's experience to understand how you harden and strengthen a network to allow you to work as openly as you can at secret, because there's still a big push right across the market and across programs now to collaborate more. But collaboration and classification don't often go hand in hand. So it's about trying to make sure that you can keep the data secure, but also allow people to interoperate and to collaborate in the best way possible. Let me just run through a couple of slides. So who are we? Give you a little bit of a background there, but we're a solely British privately owned defence company, and we are in our 8th year of trading. It was set up by a number of our founding members who, I'm pleased to say, a number of which are still with us. So primarily our CEO, Peter Williamson, who's an ex-submariner himself. And obviously, as Andrew's touched on, we're a Gold Covenant signee to the Armed Forces Covenant. We have quite a lot of ex-military personnel across the business, of which Jim and I are just one of a couple, a couple of a number that are across both of our offices. We are definitely still an SME by the government definitions, so we're growing approximately 40% year on year, but we're still at the smaller end of the defence market. So circa 75, I think we're probably getting on towards 80 something employees now this year, with 2 key locations. Our head office is in Reading, which is where the kind of the front of house, I guess, would be the space to describe it. So all the corporate functions, sales, business development, marketing, human resources, finance, all of the kind of the business functions are situated in Reading, and that's where our demonstration suite is. As you can imagine, with a defence customer, a lot of the people that want to come and talk to us are based at High Wycombe, Andover, main building in London. So Reading is a good centre for that. However, our engineering facility and engineering headquarters is based in Stoke-on-Trent, which is where Jim's joining us from today. It's a space that we've grown into. So we were originally just over the road, or just around the corner, sorry, in Old Sager near Crewe, but recently migrated over to Stoke-on-Trent to help the growth. So that's where our facility, our security cleared facility is. So that's where a lot of the classified work has to be completed. So the Reading office is more unclassified, but all of the clever bits and all the putting together of the complex systems takes place up at Stoke-on-Trent behind some fairly robust physical security layers. And worth saying, as it says on the end of there, so our product development team, which Jim sits within in terms of charge with innovating and providing the products for the next set of services and deliverables, is sat up in Stoke-on-Trent, but it's also where our service desk and all of our service operations sit. So for those of you that are still in the military that may well be on the receiving end of one of our services, if there's ever a challenge or an issue, then the guys and girls that you talk to on the phone are based up in Stoke-on-Trent. So they do all of our service management. A little bit about what we do. So as I touched on before, not a cloud provider, but definitely somebody or a company that uses cloud architecture wherever possible to enable the outcome. So we provide secure comms, we provide collaboration platforms, sometimes whole systems and networks, or simplified sometimes into just environments for programs. And one of the main success stories and one of our flagship services is that we provide to Team Tempest. So again, for any Air Force guys on the call, I'm sure you'll be aware of the ambitions for the future fighter or future combat air system. The network that underpins that program was designed and built by Jim, rolled out by our service operations teams, and is still being maintained today, 4 years later, as the backbone of that program and what they do a lot of their work on. So I'm sure there'll be some questions around that, and we'll touch on that in a bit more detail. We have had and continue to do a fair bit of work around cyber. So we previously maintained the defence cyber capability, small as it was called then. So one of the, it's supposed to be man portable, I think, Jim, wasn't it? But it was probably still a 4-man carry. But it was a relatively portable cyber defence system that could be moved around to exercises or remote locations to provide defence of those cyber networks. So I'm sure that'll be something that will come up in some of the questions. But ultimately, it comes down to digital transformation. Digital transformation has happened across a lot of other sectors. And quite often we end up with military commanders sat in front of us saying, I want the advantages that Formula One have. I want the efficiencies that the airline industry has. And often they are driven by a pretty open architecture behind the scenes that allows them to use things like Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google Cloud to be able to drive that digital transformation and be digital from the core. It's not that easy for defence to do that, and again, I don't want to trample on Jim's pit too much, but I'm sure he'll talk to you about the wide array of architecture that defence sits on. There is everything that you could imagine and more. Sometimes you go to a defence customer in 2022 and say, can I have a copy of your data? And it comes on a floppy disk. That is not that crazy that you'd be given something on a pretty archaic format or even on paper or on a clipboard, right the way through to databases and things that are much more easy to integrate with. So yeah, it's all about that, enabling that digital transformation, and it could be any one of those solutions that you see in the top right corner there, from some communication work right the way through to a full collaborative platform. Let's click through to the next one. A little bit about our people. So these are our executive board. So as we've grown over the years, we've obviously recruited and grown to match it. So Peter, as I've already covered, is our founder and CEO, ex-Submariner by background, and still really active amongst the defence community. I'll work from right to left on the bottom. So our Chief Operating Officer, Scott Payton, so fairly recent joining to the company, came in about 6 months ago, but lots of big company experience where he's helped to grow other defence businesses and has come to us from somewhere where we would have previously competed. So I guess that's always a good measure. If someone's willing to join you from a competitor, we can't be doing too bad a job. Raj and Rob then, who are two of the other founding members. So Raj has got a corporate finance background, so naturally as our finance director looks after us anywhere where money's concerned. And again, for those that may have done a bit of background research, you'll see we have taken some investment, as often these businesses do of our size, but we're still very high percentage owned by the original founders, and certainly all UK and sovereign in our basis. And Rob is another ex-military chap, so 22 years as a comms engineer, did a little bit of work with Peter towards the end of his service career. So, we're going to come on to routes from A to B. Secondments and work experience and kind of industry-facing roles is a great way to get that foot in the door, and that's what Rob did. So he did, I think it was 3 years on secondment with a company that was managing what was then Air Force mail contract back in the 90s. And that gave a really good landing then into a new role, because it wasn't a risk for the civilian organisation hiring him, because they already understood how he worked. They already knew that he understood their systems and their ways of so transition for Rob was managed that way. And the final name on the list is General Lord Nick Houghton. So he has recently joined as our chairman of the board. He sits on the board of a number of big defence companies, the likes of Thales and Draken, to name but a few. So really, really well networked. Obviously, previous CDS, as you can see from his bio, provides a whole another level of access across defence and across the sector. Chairman of the board from the 1st of April. In terms of timeline, formed in 2014, as you can see. 2015, we stood up our original secure working facility. 2018 was when the Tempest contract was signed, so that was the first kind of big move for SecureCloudPlus, and where I'll come back to in a minute. Lord Houghton joining the board of directors last year, and very recently announced in the Times top 100 as some of the fastest growing companies in the UK. So I'm going to touch back to 2018, because I did say I'd do a bit of intro on me. So I was Air Force commissioned officer by background. So I was on the Puma helicopter fleet for 12 years. Absolutely loved it. Got to see all sorts of parts of the world and places that you wouldn't ordinarily go on a package holiday, but it was a good adventure. Absolutely loved the days that I served. A number of factors conspired really to kind of join up for me leaving. So I had a bit of a back injury, which is not uncommon for those that work on helicopters, combined with a realization that I was probably going to do less and less flying. And therefore, if I was going to do a job that was a bit more desk-based, then what were the opportunities to do a desk-based role in the outside world rather than the military? And ultimately wanted to go somewhere where I could make a bit of a difference, because again, for all those in the military, it's great when the team pulls together, but it's a big, big team. And sometimes I think it's very easy to get lost in the size of the team. So for me, when I left, one of the main things I wanted was to go into somewhere where not a name, not a number, I guess, to put it in a simple phrase, rather than being a service number, bums on seats, as sometimes it can feel in the military game. Joining an organisation at 2018, which I think had 45, 50 people, I could pretty much name everybody in the business, and that was a big differentiator for me. I wanted to go into a small industry where I could fit in, but feel like you were making a difference. So joining the business, I'm not really sure they knew where I was going to fit, and Jim will probably back me up on this. So I was given a military title because that was the easiest way to do it. So I joined the business as the chief of staff, mostly because I think they knew that I would know what that meant. Whereas if they give me an overly corporate title, I probably would have faltered. So I spent the first year kind of moving around the business, supporting the chief operating officer, and honestly, it was the most wide and varied role you could imagine, from hiring and firing people to helping with strategy to helping with things like our office move from one location to another, and all sorts of kind of special projects is the best way I can describe it. So I was a spare resource that didn't have a particularly high list of structured jobs, but if ever a project spun up or a new thing that needed to be done, that's where I would be kind of seconded in to go, right, can you help put a bit of a project plan behind that, or help move those things along? So that was a great role to land into. And when we talk about transition, I think there's hard and soft landings. The way I definitely took a soft landing, because I moved into an organization which I already understood half the language. I won't profess to understand the technology side of the language, but I certainly understood all the military speak. So I could at least sit in the room with an ex-colleague and translate their challenge and their problem over to people like Jim and Jim's team and say, that's what they mean when they say that. This is the actual problem they're trying to solve. So having the domain knowledge already really helped, and that meant I only had to learn the technology. I say only, obviously there's a fair ramp to climb there to get up to speed with technology, having flown a helicopter that was designed in the 60s, because there wasn't much technology in that. I then moved into head of operations, which was a bit of a step up. So to have a head of in the commercial world, I think is quite different to a head of in the military. You're commercially accountable, financially accountable, which is very different to the military, but being in charge of things like profit and loss, being in charge of running an organization, a part of the organization efficiently, making sure that you're compliant to all your contracts, making sure that we're getting engineers out on time to all those incidents or all those changes that are happening around the services. So that was a really eye-opening 12 months, and that's where I learned about things like ITIL, which was going to be on my list of kind of training fundamentals. If you can get some of those big framework ticks, I think that always helps, because at interview, at least you can talk the right language, even if you don't have 5 years ITIL experience. If you can understand how to apply it as a framework, I think that's a good thing to have. And more recently, I've moved into a role, strategic defence lead. So that has been sales, which is not somewhere where I thought I would find myself when I left the military, but sales and business development. But I do think that sales back into the military is very different to, I think, what most people would imagine as sales, because you don't sell something to the military very quickly. It's much more of what we would describe as a consultative sales process. So it's about understanding their processes, understanding their challenges, and properly working with a customer to an outcome. You're not just going, I've got a box of technology. How many bits of technology would you like? You know, as a managed service provider, it's a very different sell. So that's where I've ended up in. But enough about kind of company and me. As I said, I'm also joined on the call today by Jim Booth. So Jim, I'll hand over to you for a bit of history and your roles and transition out of the military.
Sorry, it was on mute as usual. Hi everyone, my name's Jim Booth. Currently I sit in SecureCloudPlus as the Chief Architect. And since I am much more of a technical type of person and have a background in cybersecurity, it's probably better that I go into my background a little bit deeper than Steve is able to go to in his. So I joined the military in 1987 as an airfield technician in electronics. I've always been into computers. Computers was not a thing in the military back then. We were stuck back in 486s and 386s and so on and so forth, for those that are old enough to even remember what those mean. Yeah, Andrew smirking. Stephen, Andrew smirking, aren't you? So my path through the military was more ground electronics. I am airfields by trade, ex-trade group 3, currently trade, or was left as trade group 4. I went through working on airfield surveillance radars, ground to air, ground to ground electronics, airfield systems, comm systems, all that kind of stuff, all the good stuff, all the stuff that will guide people like Steve back to the airfield safely and talk to them. When computers became a thing, the military, or the RAF as it was, looked for ways to incorporate IT into their ways of working. And what they did, they developed something called Trade Group 4. Now, Trade Group 4 is an amalgamation of 2 trades, Trade Group 11 and Trade Group 3. Trade Group 11, you've met one of our founders, Rob Gittings, is ex-Trade Group 11, which was ComSend type of work. Trade Group 3 was all electronics. And that's when I got into IT properly as a profession. When that transition happened, I could have gone down 2 paths, and I chose the IT path because I'm a geek by birth. I think I was born with a keyboard in one hand and a mouse in the other. So on that journey, I worked in IT at a place called RAF Odium, and working on the RAF mail systems and the local systems at the time, which weren't interconnected. They weren't centrally managed like they are these days. So each unit had all its own equipment, all its own email servers and file servers and so on. And so I was responsible for looking after those. From there, I went to Cosford as an instructor. I taught people everything from how to break and build a PC, all the way up to Cisco networking, Windows Server 2003, because yes, it was that long ago. And in the latter 7 years at Cosford, because I was there quite a while, I did cybersecurity. Now, back then, cybersecurity was rather a dark art, the dark subject. People simply wouldn't engage in the conversation. And I was tasked by a gentleman called Wing Commander Raf Brown to generate course training material for Trade Group 4 and the Eng Officer Training Corps for cybersecurity. This was more of a challenge than you might imagine, because most training is based on a training needs analysis. If you went to GCHQ, for example, and asked them what training needs analysis you would need for one of their specialists, they would just laugh you out of the building because it was kind of giving away capability. So it was very difficult. We got it off the ground, it got up and running. I designed and built the first cyber range that was used for training at Cosford, which I'm not sure if it's still in use today. It's been quite a few years since I went back. And while all that was going on, I wasn't getting any older. My career was coming towards, it's like 25, 26 years, 27 years. And I was staring kind of 30 years and out in the face. So it just so happened that one of my colleagues I was working with at Cosford, he had previously worked with our head of finance, Robert Gittins, in the same role as Rob, and went on to the same private company as Rob. And so when the company was founded in 2014, they quickly founded it on the back of business at RAF Waddington, delivering a capability that would see all their disparate secret networks brought together under a single umbrella. They got contracted for that, but had no one to deliver it. Of the 6 people that founded the company, there was not a single delivery engineer among them. So Rob, being ex-military and knew that Martin, my colleague, was into that sort of thing, contacted him for help. Martin couldn't help him because Martin, like Rob, was ex-Trade Group 3, ex-Trade Group 11. So Martin asked me if I could help, and that's how I got involved with SecureCloudPlus at the very start. They then effectively offered me a job. In the position I was in, I thought, do you know what? Why not? So whereas Steve had quite a soft transition, he would, as he describes, mine was incredibly. It was a hard stop. It was literally on a Friday. I was finishing off my paperwork and handing stuff in and having final interviews on the base with the various commanders, to on the Monday working for SecureCloudPlus. It was literally that quick. And so I joined the business in 2014, not long after it was set up, as effectively employee number 1, pretty much. I've been with the company since its inception. Then I was just asked to do all the engineering side, so all the building, the design, and so on. And trust me when I tell you, it was a shock. It was a massive, massive shock. I was so out of my depth, it was scary. And it took a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of coursework in my own time to kind of find the answers that the business needed to move forward. Now, as the business moved forward, so did I. So I went from effectively being a one-man shop in designing, building, delivering, transitioning into service and supporting, to where I am now as the chief architect, and I've gone up through them layers in the company because mainly based on their trust of my performance, since I've been there. When I left the military, I joined as a cyber reservist, so I did my weekend workings down at Corsham once or twice a month for 2 or 3 years. Before that got a bit too much because it's a fair old drive down there every few weeks, and so I reluctantly canned that, and that's kind of where I am today. So my role currently is the chief architect, working in like the R&D space. As Steve said, is to bring together the various different technologies to deliver the solutions that the customer requires, but also looking to the future. So looking to what the next level of what the Team Tempest will require, such as being able to work from home, which wasn't what they asked for when they took that contract out, but they needed it with the coronavirus and so on. And now they want to extend that even further. I mean, that project's gone way beyond what it was expected to do. So I also have a governance role, so I look after pretty much most of the projects that come through from a governance point of view, giving them the once over, making sure they're all fit for purpose, secure by design, and all that kind of good stuff. If you're going to ask me what courses I've kind of done to get to this point, yeah, it's none. Mainly because for the last 7-8 years, I've been running at 100 miles an hour to get this done, and training other people up, giving new people through the business the opportunity to get the skills background and the course background that I didn't have, because they then provide the foundations that support me going forward. And that's pretty much it, really, from me.
I think Jim makes a really good point there. I just want to jump on it because you've probably never got a better time to upskill than your transition window. Because as Jim's rightly described there, once you're out and you are earning and you're expected to do a job, you know, corporately and commercially, and I think that's the big difference I found from military to the commercial world is there is a lot to do with money and cost efficiency, and therefore if you're being paid to deliver a service, there's not a huge amount of time for you to upskill. Now we do have training budgets and we do get people away on training, so it's not to say that it won't happen, but your best time is that time, that resettlement leave, that terminal leave, you know, that period at which you decided you're going, but you haven't got that new role yet. You've got to upskill yourself the best you can in that time. And one of the roles that I've done in around the strategic defence role is a bit of graduate development. So we get sales graduates in who have absolutely no military grounding, they have no technical grounding, and it's trying to get them up to speed quickly in a sales world. Some of the courses I recommend to them is that things like ITIL. So it's a real soft landing for service management. It gives you loads of terminology you can fall back on, lots of understanding of process, and you can apply it to all sorts of different scenarios, and you probably will do if you go on to do that training module. But it's a quick win. It's a couple of days. It's not an overly onerous task. There's a little bit in there of learning the language rather than having to apply it. So depending on your ways of learning and what works for you, you might find it harder or easier. But it's one of those that is an industry benchmark. I think the other things that come up in that space are project management qualifications. So again, there's not really a role in the commercial world where a bit of PM now will do you any harm. You know, the ability to structure something, the ability to understand milestones, breaking down the bigger problem into smaller chunks and make it more manageable is always great to have. But no one's going to hire you because you've got Prince 2 on your CV. Is the other thing I would caveat with. They're great skills to have, but think of them as one string to the bow, not the bow. One which I find is a real great intro, and particularly with you guys looking at cyber and therefore wanting to be a bit more on the technology side of things, Amazon's Cloud Practitioner and Microsoft Azure Fundamentals, I think are both free courses still. They certainly were last time I looked. They give you a great intro, right? They're not going to turn you into Jim overnight, you know, but they're going to give you that understanding of what's a data center, what's resilience, what's, you know, why cloud. You know, it answers a lot of the questions that organizations ask us day in day out and go, well, is cloud more secure, or should I have it, you know, on premise? That's a number one question that we get all the time. You know, I can't put it in the cloud, it's not secure. Little do they realize it's actually probably far more secure than the ways, you know, the legacy ways of working. So those Amazon and Microsoft fundamentals, you know, and they are designed that way. They want to get you in, get you trained, and then obviously there's costs to scale yourself beyond that. But I would I'd definitely encourage those as pretty easy, you know, quick wins. And then it's as Jim said, he said he hasn't done any courses, but I imagine he spent a whole load of time watching YouTube videos and on some of the learning. So Jim, I'm trying to think some of the names we've used, CBT Nuggets, and some of the others. There's portals out there that allow you to do kind of bite-sized learning where you just go in and go, you know, SQL X, what's the question? And they'll give you some modules to get it away. You don't leave with a badge, you don't leave with a certificate, but it's ability to solve those problems, I think, is something that particularly, you know, when I look at Jim amongst his team and why he's progressed all the way up to chief architect in the time that he has, it's the ability to think outside the box, not just, well, my qualification says this is the answer. It's about trying to solve problems in a different way. So there's some of the ones I'd recommend, but definitely, you know, make the most of that resettlement time, because you've got a lot of spare time there when, you know, the military is going to continue to pay you, so you don't have to worry about, you know, definitely don't be thinking I've got to be earning 2 salaries in that time. There's plenty enough time to earn money, but you've got 10, 12, I can't remember how many weeks it is, where they are paying you and you can go and do whatever you want. So get that work experience, get some training under your belt. Do kind of apprenticeships are a great way to get into businesses. We get them all the time. People who go, look, I'm on resettlement, you don't need to pay me, but can I just come and work for a couple of weeks and just get a feel for what it's like? And you might not get the most glamorous project in the world, but it's a free job interview. You know, you've got a couple of weeks where you can go and prove yourself to that organization, and they do it. I know big organizations that do it. I know small organizations that do it. So you've kind of got a range of options there, but definitely make the most of that transition time.
Yeah, thanks. That's good advice. We hear slightly different things from different employers. I hear a lot. It's actually the person that we want and their attitudes and their cultures, and we'll train them. And this seems to be a dividing line between big businesses who've got academies and lots of people to do it, and businesses of your size and slightly less, where the resources to do that are more limited. Um, uh, and your advice on those qualifications is and courses to do are absolutely consistent with others I've heard. You might be interested to know that one of the key guys who is driving Microsoft Azure's work for veterans and offering that sort of thing out and more for free is actually an ex-Navy Sea King pilot back in the day. So you helicopter types.
Oh, we get everywhere. And I think it probably brings us on to another point that I certainly know caused a bit of an allergic reaction to me when I was leaving the military, which is around networking. I think it's got a bit of a stigma and people don't want to do it, but it is such a powerful thing. And although Jim didn't mention it, the fact networking is absolutely how he got his role. Now that didn't mean he was out there, every night giving out business cards to people and cold approaching, but the fact that he knew Martin, who knew Rob, and therefore they both understood his work ethic and his output is ultimately what led to him to getting a job. And mine is even more tenuous than that. I once bumped into the CEO through some corporate event that when I was in the military and organising, and helped him out with a lift home. And he said, if you ever need a favour, make sure you call me up. And you just never know. And that favour, by the way, was a job interview, not a job. So it was just to interview me. So when I originally left the military, he interviewed me and told me I was terrible and didn't have any jobs. So I didn't actually join the company off that. I don't know if Jim actually knows that, but I interviewed for SecureCloudPlus about 6 months before I actually joined as a fresh service leaver and didn't do very well, funnily enough, because you don't interview in the military, do you? So you've got to learn how to do those kind of interview skills. But it's that network. So no one will object to a bit of LinkedIn stalking to look at who do you know from your regiment or from your service or your squadron that's now in the organisations or the types of organisations you want to go to. And I know, speaking on myself and other service leavers, I've never turned down a coffee with somebody. You've got to go to where I am. I'm not going to travel up to Lincolnshire to come have a coffee with you. But if you can get to wherever, somewhere near, more than happy to come and give up time to sit and talk to a service leaver and just help to navigate that route. Again, that's networking. Being able to name drop somebody in an organisation, go, oh yeah, I had coffee with your head of or it just all helps to understand, to make sure you're speaking the right language, you're hitting the right points when you get to that interview. Networking can be a bit of a stigma, but I would say it's really, really important to do that, but not in a cheesy way, just in a.
Yeah, I think it's becoming less of a stigma. And to endorse your point there, I haven't met a single person in 12 years since I left the army who isn't prepared to help, support, talk to, have a coffee with another another ex-military person at least once. They might choose not to do it after that, and I think steadily everyone is beginning to understand that, and it's not just about going and drinking warm wine in an old club somewhere as it would have been done. And LinkedIn makes it easier. And the point you make about if you're targeting a company, then I always suggest that the first thing to do is to find the ex-military people in there and go in through that door and not go in through the front door, because there'll probably someone, an HR person or a process that filters you out.
Absolutely. I think all too often, Andrew, that's an automated process. So if you don't have the right letters or the right phrases in your CV, you will just get blocked at the door. Whereas you're right. I mean, and I had great success with big organisations like Deloitte and Barclays. By going through their military network, that was what actually got me in front of a hiring manager and got me to have that conversation. Ultimately, I didn't end up taking the roles, but that was infinitely more successful than kind of cold approaches. So if any of you are firing at kind of corporate job portals and feeling a bit deflated, please don't be, because that is the hardest way to get a job.
Jim, have you got anything to add to this? Any thoughts on other qualifications? I hear quite a lot about ISO 27001 lead auditor as one of those sort of frameworky things that Steve was talking about. What do you recommend to people in your travels?
Well, I suppose, and it's probably not the answer. Actually, it kind of depends. There are a lot of routes and a lot of pathways into IT in general, cybersecurity in general, computer security in general. There are so many specialized fields that if you're going to go down the more technical side of things for infrastructure, so look at places like VMware, virtualization courses, they will follow on from the Azure and AWS type courses, but more on-prem because you will have on-prem architecture to worry about. If you want to do more cyber related stuff, you can look at the SANS courses. There's some very good SANS courses out there. They aren't cheap, but I mean, I still think, do they still have the old education budget?
Yeah, early learning credits are still alive.
Yeah, that's it, yeah, ELC, and they are available for a number of years after you've left. So, you know, you use them wisely, because I've used them and they are incredibly valuable. So you've got the SANS type courses if you want to go down more the forensics route or the analyst route. If you want to go down sort of like management or into security in general, you've always got your CISP type courses and your CISM type courses. Yeah, it kind of all depends on where you're aiming for. But the one thing, and Steve's mentioned it before, I've interviewed many people, and I've interviewed people on attitude alone, on their ethos and the way they present themselves. That goes a massive long way. And the Forces gives you that confidence and it gives you that ethos. Use it to your advantage in interviews because you wouldn't believe how valuable that is to employers.
Yeah, it's another great point. And I see an awful lot of people losing confidence at the critical moment when they're sort of heading for an interview, and all that confidence that people have got in their military environment or blagging it can evaporate because the context is different, the language is different, and they're faced by people they don't know and understand. So practicing that stage of the process is really important as well. But yeah, I'd endorse that completely. Just a reminder, pop things into the chat if you would like. I want to return to sales and business development, Steve, because very unexpectedly I ended up doing exactly that when I thought I was heading for a military charity. And I actually found it rewarding and stimulating and challenging work. And I suppose most of us think that sales is all about gift of the gab. And actually, it is about having good communication skills, but it's also about being organized and analyzing tender documents. I'm just doing that at the moment with the Career Transition Partnership retender, a real joy that is, and being able to answer those clearly and succinctly. It's not just about blabbing away in a conference room, but perhaps if you give us your spin on that, because I think it's not a job that many of us think that we can do, and even if we do, is it something that people can go straight into, or like you and me, have you taken a sort of journey to get into sales and business development?
Yeah, so I think you're right, Andrew. It's a difficult one to jump straight into, and I certainly would never have imagined myself stepping out of a uniform and into a sales job. Certainly not one selling back into the military, which is obviously where I've ended up. I think you're right as well in terms of the skills. There are definitely people who are absolutely the smoothest operators on a call and in a conference room, and you can't knock their confidence and their ability to just to talk the talk, and no matter the question thrown at them, absolutely confidently answer everything with a yes and somehow be able to explain it. But I think a lot of it comes down to the ability to listen as well. So be able to hear what the person is saying, not what you want them to say or what you want to think they're saying. So the ability to listen and pick up on what is somebody actually describing there, and that again, that comes back to that domain experience. So if you hear a service person describing a challenge, you might find somebody who doesn't have that service background jumps to a different conclusion, but you have that reference ability to be able to put yourself in their shoes and go, actually, that's not what they're saying. They're not saying that's where their problem is. Their pain point is probably a little bit further away. But if we can fix that, then that will achieve their outcome. So it's the ability to listen, ability to translate. I mean, there are some sales fundamentals. As I mentioned, we do a graduate training program for specifically for sales within the military, and that involves a lot of softer skills. So teach them how to listen, teaching them how to pitch, teaching them how to negotiate, because that's, you know, obviously negotiation is a big part of sales and business development. So there's definitely are some soft skills you can learn, and you know, graduates can land in and do it. So a service leaver can definitely jump in and do it. But I've certainly found it easier to get in, learn a bit about the technologies, learn a bit about the service side of it. And that way, when you come to sell it, hopefully, and Jim will laugh here, I don't go off and sell too many unicorns, because that's the worst thing you can do as a salesperson, is go and sell something that Jim can't build. You know, I've got to make sure there's a degree of realism, and the concept that I'm selling or the solution I'm selling is grounded on reality. So that's been, I've found that easier, because I've had that. I know not to oversell it, so I won't say we can fix everything in 1 hour, because I know how long it takes some of these things to be fixed, and I've been at the coalface when the system is down and the customer's on the phone trying to get it back up and running. So yeah, it's not, I say, it wasn't where I thought I was going, but I do enjoy it. It's a roller coaster. You know, sales and business development has the highest highs, but it also has the lowest lows. Sometimes when you had done absolutely nothing wrong, completely out of your control, you lose what could have been months of work into a deal. You know, I had one not too long after joining the company, actually, where the government just pulled the program, just said, we're not doing that anymore. You know, and us as a small business had invested thousands of pounds of people's time, hundreds of hours into preparing our submission for that, and they just pulled the plug, said we're not going to do it. And, you know, and obviously that can be a real low, but also the satisfaction of being able to of understanding someone's problem, translating it into a solution with them, and then actually getting to see it roll out, you know, is pretty awesome. And again, as a service leaver, to be able to walk into a military unit 3 or 4 years later and see a system on the wall that, you know, you've been a part of and is now being used, you know, to manage operations or to manage the logistics, whatever, and it is making a bit of a difference. You know, obviously that's the best bit of the sales, is being able to go and see it being used and make a difference.
Yeah, listening skills is, in fact, I think I'd take that a step further and say it's almost a skill of consulting, that sort of listening. Defence is not often very good at spelling out its requirements very clearly, often because they don't know what they want, or they don't know what is out there. So that ability to, as you say, listen and provide advice as part of that. I worked for 2 American organizations that all they wanted to do was sell stuff and then chuck it over the wall to people like Jim. That is not, of course, the way to sell to government. So sales in the defence space and in government more widely, in my experience, is not about the commercial sales that most people will associate with. The second point you make, which I'd like to pick up on, is around negotiation skills. I very, very rarely see that on a military person's CV. And yet when you sort of paint a scenario, have you ever stood in a tent at 54 degrees on an operational tour trying to negotiate a solution to a problem, surrounded by half a dozen rival tribal warlords, through an interpreter? Out come all the stories. Well, if you can do that in that environment, you can definitely negotiate your way. So these are skills that differentiate people from others, from us collectively in the marketplace. And so my advice to everyone is to really try and think about those things that you've done, the situations that you've been in, and rather than follow the template solution to a CV or indeed a job interview, is to think of those bits of evidence of those skills that you've got that are really going to apply. And negotiation skills comes everywhere if you're leading people who, many of whom are not quite so good at being told what to do as they are in the military. So you're negotiating with your colleagues, your subordinates, your superiors. It's a very, as you said earlier, it's a very, very different world. So
I think another completely underestimated skill from military is the ability to risk assess.
Yeah.
So the ability to assess and manage risk, you'd be amazed at the degree of risk aversion, I would call it, in the corporate world, where people will label things as risk to avoid doing anything about it. So whether you're at the shop floor level or at an executive level within the military, you are dealing with risk on a day-to-day basis, and you're probably dealing with risk on a pretty serious scale. I'd imagine most people on the call will have been involved in a risk to life management case in some degree, right? And when you compare that to the corporate world of the sorts of risks that are actually being managed and mitigated, you cannot compare. So, the ability to complete the estimate, the ability to break down a problem, the ability to actually see the risks and to make a decision on the safest, because ultimately, from an operational stance, you can't get there and say, I'm not doing it. It's too risky. Quite often we have to find a way, and therefore we mitigate some risk. Obviously, with the modern structures within the military, sometimes we transfer some risk, but quite often, we're managing it and we're getting the job done despite the risk. So it's one of those things that I didn't actively think about it that much when I left, but I think risk comes up a huge amount in the corporate world and even more in the bigger organizations. So the ability to be grounded in risk and actually understand how to manage it, mitigate it is another, what I think, a really strong military skill, which people should champion.
Yeah, another good one. Do you see any particular, I suppose it's really having a framework around that. A lot of the risk that we are assessing in the military world comes, as you say, from the estimate and planning process, which, by the way, does survive contact with the civilian world extremely well.
Yeah.
But again, if you're thinking CVs and getting that foot through the door, do you have any advice around a particular course? Might not be a qualification, but maybe something to give people that framework on risk management that they can use?
So I can't think of any that jump to mind at the minute. I think the thing when it comes to your CV and ultimately interviews, and it was something that I think the OA gave it to me when I was preparing to leave, was around the STAR model and being able to take a situation, describe the task, the action that you did, and then that result. If you've got a risk-based STAR example, you'll be able to turn it to whatever risk-based question you get. So I'm trying to think. I ended up doing quite a bit on health and safety and around kind of central risk management for the business when I joined here. But you're right, a lot of it I took from, my background was aviation, so I went to the MAA documentation and went, well, how do they manage risk? So there's absolutely nothing wrong, by the way, with taking something out that's out there that works and just adapting it to your company colours wherever you end up working. And particularly in a growing organisation, you're not going to arrive at an SME of 45 people and they're going to have everything documented. A lot of it needs to be created, it needs to be designed to fit. So yeah, I mean, there are ISOs out there. So, you mentioned about 27001, we've got a number of ISOs. So getting your teeth into things like the quality ISO around 9,000, service management ISO in 20,000. So there's lots of those that provide a framework for you to get to grips with stuff. But a lot of the military manuals of how to manage risk are just having a grounding and understanding it, I think, will step people further ahead than they realise.
Thanks for that. Jim, have you got anything to add to this conversation?
No, Steve's doing a really good job for me.
Well, you're both doing a really good job, because although we haven't got many people on the call today, we're going to slice and dice this because there's some invaluable advice here for people around the job seeking part. If anyone's got any more last questions, please pop them into the chat.
I know, Andrew, that you've spoken a lot, and Steve's spoken a lot about transferable skills that are valuable. Oddly, there are transferable skills that are not all that valuable. And one in particular, and it's one I fell foul of, was when we were a small company, I was involved in parts of the sales process, almost like a technical pre-sales, keeping Rob honest about what he was selling, basically, and what our capabilities were. The problem comes there is, being the engineering background, I was too honest. I was too helpful. A customer, for example, will come to me and say, I need it to do X more than it was capable of doing, or more than that they paid for. I'd be like, yeah, of course I can. Of course I can add that capability. Of course I can make it do that. That's not a problem. And I'd have Rob staring daggers at me over the table going, no, make it, there's money attached to that. So whilst we have this ever helpful, ever moving forward attitude to helping people and being the best that we can be, sometimes you have to temper that in the corporate world and in the business world, because it doesn't always get you where you think it will. And it seems like an odd case, but
no, I think it's a very good point. And I've heard people talk about the military's mission focus being unhelpful, particularly if you're a chief finance officer, because achieving the mission at all costs is probably going to cost the organization or your client a ton of money. That is not necessarily the most helpful approach. So we do have to temper these things that are ingrained into us as we move into the corporate world, and understand the consequences, which we might have. It's a big firm mentality in the military is not always going to be welcome in the organizations that we work for. I think the other thing that your comment there sparks in my mind is we've also got to be ready to challenge stereotypical views of military people. I hear all the time, oh yeah, military are great, but they can only give or take orders. And actually, that is not the case. It might have been the case once upon a time. It might be the case in certain parts of the armed forces, but most people, I think, have got a very good argument against that. So we have to be ready for these sorts of stereotypes. They might not come out overtly, but they're perhaps sitting behind some of the questions that people ask. So it's very important to challenge those stereotypical views if they do emerge. It's also important to ask questions of people during interviews, or well, at any stage actually. Don't just, if asked have you got any questions, saying no is probably not the right answer. We're drawing to an end. Steve, have you got any other last thoughts?
So I would just reinforce that, Andrew, that last point you made, because as an interviewer sitting on the other side now, there is nothing worse than getting to the end of what's been a great hour potentially. Then you ask the candidate, and have you got any questions for us? And they dry up. An interview is a two-way process. So when you get to those, you need to figure out if the company's a good fit for you as much as you're a good fit for them. So I would always have 3 or 4 questions in your book or on your, on your post-it note next to the camera if it's a Zoom call, that are your questions for them, and they should be about how they operate, how they dealt with things like COVID, what their culture was like, what's their reaction in a crisis, or you need to get under the skin of them a little bit, because ultimately you're going to be turning up and spending a lot of time with those people and in that organization. So definitely that one. The only other point I had in my notes that I wanted to make is around security clearance. Through a product of circumstance, all of those service leavers at the minute have a golden ticket in that you have a security clearance. Because of a number of factors in the outside world, there is an enormous backlog for new security clearances. So people leaving the military with an active clearance, be that an SC, DV or higher, and going into an industry where you're working back in the secure space, whether that's for a big commercial organization or for a small SME back into defence, there's a lot of roles that require clearance. That is worth an amount, and certainly puts you ahead of other candidates, because and this is not protected information, but defence contracts that are coming out now, 9 times out of 10 they state they will not provide security clearances as part of that tender. So go back 2 or 3 years, you could say, I will go and bid for that piece of work and I will get my team cleared as part of it. That's just not the case anymore. There is such a backlog because of COVID and because of a number of other factors. It's just not happening. So definitely, if your clearance is going to lapse in the next few weeks before you leave, don't let it. And when you leave, be conscious of your validity dates, because if you can get into a role with a company, SecureCloudPlus is a List-X company, so we're able to hold security clearances. The ability to transfer that, can be really useful. And I've certainly maintained mine for the 4 years since I've left. So it's another string to the bow, as we said earlier. So yeah, definitely let that lapse.
It's another string to the bow, as you're implying there. It's also more money. You've got a premium,
yep.
And you will have employers chasing after you, particularly if you've got a DV. And so you're in a whole world of new choice. I even advised someone recently to delay leaving until they had gone through their regained their security clearance, because it was going to be of such value to them.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you for raising that. It's a minefield, and it's taking organisations forever to to get people through
Yeah.
a painful process. Okay. Anyone got any other questions? The chat is very quiet today.
There's one just gone in from John.
Sorry, say again.
There's a question just gone in from John Angrave. Don't know if that's have you seen that one?
No, I haven't. Can't see. Put my glasses on. That's what I need to do.
So he's in sales now. Would like to keep military connection, but not in sales.
Okay, off you go.
Service point technical, whatever it's saying. Starting a cyber sales role would help me move over to a more technical role. I think it depends on where you go, John. So there are technical pre-sales roles where you can be a specialist. They have that sales transition, and you're often dealing more in the concept space rather than the architecture space as Jim sits in. So it could be a route. And again, I know a lot of the big defense kind of big vendors, so the likes of kind of Dell, NetApp, AWS, etc. You can get pre-sales roles into them where you can learn their technology. So there's a degree of selling because you've got to be able to sell the benefits of their kit, but it might help you transition out of that. I know a lot of people go tech pre-sales then into actual engineering and architecture roles later down the line because pre-sales tends to be quite broad. You can't really be a specialist at the pre-sales level. You've got to understand the full range of that company or that sector's technology to know, to kind of apply it in handfuls, and then you would go into a more detailed level and become, I don't know, a network specialist or a virtualization specialist to then go and sit in someone like Jim's team.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Good question, John. And thanks for it. I'm a veteran, by the way, of 664 Squadron Army Air Corps, just to take us back into the day. I think your question is a good one because cyber is a very broad church. So it probably is quite a good starting point because, yes, there are very technical sales roles in cyber, but there's an awful lot of that where your military security training experience is directly transferable into cybersecurity. And just as Steve was talking earlier about risk and risk analysis and mitigation being part of our every aspect of life in the military. So that general security knowledge is extremely useful in a sales role. And as we were discussing earlier, if you're trying to listen to a client articulate their security requirements, which very often are a bolt-on last-minute thought or late thought in the process, then that you'll be going back to your military roots there and looking at it through that particular lens rather than necessarily as a conventional sales capacity. So I think you're probably right in suggesting that going from your current sort of regional sales and into cyber as part of a transition to a more deeper technical, that's probably a good way of doing it because you've got that sales experience elsewhere. And if I could remove from job descriptions the first line of every one that says you need experience of doing something, doing the job that you're applying for before you even apply for it, then I would. And this is an example, or you've come up with an example where you're using your sales experience to get you into a different version of sales to then get you somewhere else. And once you're in another organization, particularly a big one, there are those opportunities open up as soon as you're inside the door. So thanks for the question, John. Any others popped up while I'm waffling? Okay, we're 1 minute over. Steve, Jim, thank you very much indeed. There's some absolute gold dust in there. As I say, I'm going to extract some of that and pop that up as good advice to all sorts of job seekers. So thank you for taking the time to do that. Really interesting to learn a little bit more about SecureCloudPlus. And you're obviously on a rocket ride. What Nick Houghton will do to that, I've no idea, but it's giving my regards. And thank you very much for an extremely valuable hour, and wish you well. And on behalf of everyone, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think I know we touched on it in the call, but if anyone does want a coffee or a chat on LinkedIn, please do reach out. I'm sure Jim will reciprocate if it's more technical, but happy to have a coffee or a chat with any service leavers if it helps.
Thank you. All the best, everyone. Thanks for joining.